In 1971, at the University of Pennsylvania, psychologists Lauren Alloy and Lynn Abramson took two groups of students, depressed and healthy, and set them down in front of a button. Sometimes the button turned on a light, and sometimes it didn't. The task was simple: estimate how much your pressing influenced the outcome. The healthy participants in the experiment found a relationship between the button and the light. The depressed participants found that there was no relationship at all. And there really was absolutely no relationship. The experiment was called depressive realism. Depressed people perceived reality more accurately, while healthy people systemically overestimated their ability to affect the world. We are used to think that depression distorts reality. But what if the healthy brain distorts it too? Today I'll tell you about a method that made it possible to access your own internal interpreter, and not only read its logs, but even fix something inside it. We'll be talking about cognitive behavioral therapy. In the early 1960s, Aaron Beck is a practicing and respected psychoanalyst. He believes in Freud, has undergone his own analysis, and works with patients according to all the rules: free association, transference, the unconscious. And so he's working with depressed patients. And he notices something strange. According to Freudian logic, depression is aggression turned inward. And the patient, on some level, should be deriving pleasure from suffering. A kind of masochistic satisfaction. That is what the theory predicts. Beck starts testing this. He asks patients to describe what is going on in their heads right during the session. And he discovers that there is no hidden pleasure, but there is something else. A stream of thoughts, fast, almost unpredictable even to the patient. I'm saying stupid things. He thinks I'm a loser. I'm wasting his time. Nothing will change. The patient doesn't report this, not because they are hiding it, but because they don't consider it important. It's background noise, something taken for granted. Beck calls them automatic thoughts, and he realizes that in all his depressed patients, this stream has the same structure, a specific configuration. He formulates it as a cognitive triad, a negative view of the self, the world and the future. Three vectors that are always present together. This is the moment that's important to really feel. Beck is not saying depressed people think bad thoughts. He is saying that their information processing is systematically distorted. The problem is not in the content, but in the architecture of the system, or more precisely, in the interpreter of reality. And the process of interpreting reality at such a low, one might say machine level, that is thinking. Beck starts thinking, okay, if the problem is in thinking, then that's where we need to go in. But psychoanalysis doesn't work that way. Psychoanalysis starts from the premise that the problem lies in what has been repressed into the unconscious, and that one must try to dig it out from there through various indirect roads. But Aaron Beck decided to try working specifically with a stream of the thoughts that surfaced in patients right during the session. Not to go deep, but to take what comes up on the surface in real time. It sounds almost indecently simple. At first, colleagues were skeptical of the idea. Psychiatry at the time was moving toward pharmacology. The first antidepressants has been discovered, and the future was clearly in pills. Talk therapy focused on wrong thoughts looked like a step backward into naivety. But Beck does something psychotherapists before him had practically not done. He starts measuring randomized studies, control groups, standardized scales. He wanted to know, does this work or not? How well? For whom? And it turned out that it works. Moreover, it is comparable to antidepressants for mild and moderate depression, with fewer relapses in the long term. Beck described the relationship between thoughts, emotions and behavior as a feedback system. Behavior confirms the thought. The thought generates the emotion reinforces the behavior. Here we have a loop. Later, this turned into the didactic triangle that today appears in every introduction to CBT. A classic example: a person thinks, people don't like me, hereby avoids social situations, gets no disconfirming experience, the belief strengthens, the thought becomes even more automatic. The system is not broken, it is stable. That is exactly why depression doesn't go away on its own, it is in equilibrium. And here we get to the key point that makes CBT a system tool rather than a set of positive thinking techniques. You can enter the loop from any point. Through behavior, it's called behavioral activation. Through the body, others will add that later. But cognition is the most accessible entry point because you can work with it verbally right there in the office right now. This is an engineering solution. Let's find the intervention point with the least resistance. But this is only the beginning. Beck's students and followers later did what all good systemizers do. They began to catalog. If there are distortions in information processing, let's build a taxonomy of them. By the 1980s, something like a consensus takes shape. A set of patterns emerges, reproduced in different people, with different histories in different cultures. When Burns publishes Feeling Good in 1980, a book that sold 4 million copies and that psychiatrists began literally prescribing to patients instead of an initial appointment, he bets precisely on the list. 10 cognitive distortions, memorable, structured, something you can hang on the fridge. I'll break them down by analogy with engineering bugs. Selective abstraction is a filter at the input. The system lets through only a certain type of data. Imagine a logger that records only errors. We look at the logs and see only crashes. Technically, the logger is not lying. It is simply applying a filter we have already forgotten about. A person has a good day, does several important things, talks to a friend, and at the end thinks the day was wasted, because one conversation turned awkward. The system registered the awkwardness. Everything else didn't pass through the filter. Overgeneralization is an induction error. One case turns into a universal law. You fail one job interview, and you think, I don't know how to sell myself. One person doesn't call back. People always ignore me. In programming, this is called overfitting. The model trains on too small a sample and starts mistaking noise for a pattern. What's interesting is that this distortion is especially resilient precisely because inductive thinking is an evolutionary, very ancient and very useful strategy. A snake of a certain color bit you once, your legs swelled for a week afterward. Always avoid snakes like that now. The problem is that the social environment is incomparably more complex than the environment this algorithm was written for. Catastrophizing is a specific bug in the prediction model. The system doesn't merely consider negative scenarios, it assigns them a probability close to 1 and stops considering alternatives. Imagine a risk planner that upon detecting any threat immediately switches into a "we're doomed" mode. This is the bug I often catch myself on. Interestingly, catastrophizing is very often combined with another pattern – minimization, a resource scaling error. The system applies different coefficients to data with different signs. The negative is accepted without verification, while the positive is immediately discounted. I just got lucky. Anyone could have done it. They were just being polite. In engineering terms, this is an asymmetric loss function. Some incoming data pass through unfiltered, while others are cut off at the input. The result is a systematically distorted picture, even though each individual signal is processed in a technically correct way. Personalization is an attribution error. External events are assigned an internal cause by default. The boss comes in gloomy, I must have done something wrong. The child is doing badly at school, I'm a bad mother. The system assumes causality where there isn't enough data for attribution. This too is not a random failure. The sense of control is a powerful psychological need. Personalization paradoxically gives an illusion of agency even where there is none. The system chooses it is my fault over it's random, because the first option preserves the feeling that there is a lever to pull. All or nothing thinking is a binary classification in a non-binary system. This one really annoys me. Either success or failure, either I am a good person or a bad one, either everything is under control or it's chaos. The gradient is compressed into two values. This is especially destructive when paired with perfectionism, because any deviation from the maximum automatically falls into the category of zero. You did it 80% well, you failed. Jumping to conclusions. The system skips the verification step and goes straight to the result. It exists in two subtypes: mind reading, the conviction that you know what other people are thinking, like he didn't reply because he's angry with me, and fortune telling, predicting the future as fact, like it won't work anyway. Emotional reasoning is an error of substituting the data source. The logic goes like this: I feel anxious, therefore there is a threat. I feel guilty, therefore I am guilty. The emotion is taken as a description of reality rather than a signal about how the system is interpreting reality. The sensor consistently, systematically shows the wrong result, and its readings begin to be treated as reality. Should statement is an error of hard-coded rules. I should handle everything myself. People should be fair. I shouldn't get angry. Every mismatch between the rule and reality generates distress, not because something bad has happened, but because an internal code has been violated. In programming terms, these are hard-coded constraints without exception handling. The system doesn't account for states in which the rule is not fulfilled and crashes every time reality creates one. Labeling is the final point of the taxonomy and the most resistant to change. A single event or pattern collapses into a global identity label. Not I made a mistake, but I'm a loser. Not that was a rude thing to do, but he is a bad person. The difference is fundamental. You can work with a mistake, you cannot work with an identity. In engineering terms, it's like none in JavaScript. A type so universal that it absorbs any operation and always returns itself. Whatever happens, yeah, he's just none. And amusingly, if we compare none strictly to none, it will return false, meaning you can't even compare it with itself. The label is not verified, it simply exists. But here's what's important to say about this whole list. These are not pathologies. Not one of these distortions is a sign of mental disorder. Everyone has them, to different degrees and in different contexts. They are normal heuristics of a normal brain. Kahneman and Tversky, who were working at roughly the same time on prospect theory and systematic errors of judgment, showed the same thing from another angle. The brain works fast and cheap. Heuristics are shortcuts that in most situations produce an acceptable result. They only become a problem when the environment no longer matches the one those shortcuts were written for. But okay, since we are here, since we arrived at the idea that these cognitions are a bug and not a feature, how do we fix them? You can't just tell a patient, "You're simply thinking wrong, go ahead and start thinking correctly." That wouldn't be therapy, it would be an argument, and the patient most likely lose that argument in the office and win it in their own head immediately afterward. So another mechanism was needed. Beck returned to the golden classic, Socratic dialogue. Socratic dialogue is a method where you initially accept the other person's thesis, take them by the hand, and together through guiding questions, arrive at the point where the other person reaches a contradiction. Or maybe you yourself reach the contradiction. That happened to Socrates too. The patient says, "I'm a failure." The CBT therapist doesn't say, "No, that's not true." They ask, "What exactly happened that makes you think that?" The patient explains, and then the therapist says, "Okay, and what evidence do you have that this is true?" The patient lists it. Then a question, "And is there any evidence that contradicts this conclusion?" A pause. If your friend were in the same situation, would you also call them a failure? That last question is a separate tool called the double standard. People with depression almost always apply criteria to themselves that they would never apply to another person. When this becomes visible, the system starts to stumble. The goal of these questions is not to convince the patient that everything is fine. The goal is to move the automatic thought into the status of a hypothesis. An automatic thought is a fact. It is not discussed. It simply is. It is reality. As long as it remains a fact, it is impossible to work with. As soon as it becomes a hypothesis, it acquires epistemic status. It can be tested. It has evidence for and against it. It may turn out to be true, partially true, or false. This is the transition from perception mode to investigation mode. And healing in this case comes precisely as these skills develops. The ability to consciously switch on investigation mode in relation to your own thoughts. Socratic dialogue proved itself well as a clinical tool. But Beck fairly quickly came to the conclusion that automatic thoughts, which he had learned to fight, were only a symptom, behind which stood something more stable. Beneath them was a second layer, intermediate beliefs. These are the rules and assumptions that generate automatic thoughts. They usually take the form of conditional constructions. If I make a mistake, I'll be rejected. If I don't control the situation, a catastrophe will happen. In order to have value, I must be productive. They are harder to catch because they are not spoken aloud. They operate as background rules of the operating system. You don't see them in the interface, but they determine how every incoming request is processed. They are caught through patterns. If a person reacts with anxiety again and again to situations of a certain type, there is a rule behind it. One way to get to it is the downward arrow technique. The therapist takes an automatic thought and asks the same question again and again. And if that's true, what would it mean for you? The patient answers, the question is repeated, and so it goes for several iterations until the chain runs into something fundamental. For example, I messed up the presentation, that means I'm incompetent, that means I'll be fired, that means I won't be able to take care of myself. Here we are no longer dealing with an automatic thought. Here there is a rule, and possibly even a schema. When the rule is finally formulated out loud, that in itself is already a shift, because an explicit belief can be challenged. You can ask, does every mistake always mean rejection? Are there examples when it doesn't? Where did this rule even come from? When and in what context did it make sense? But the main thing is this: as long as the rule remains an invisible background process, it is invulnerable. As soon as it becomes an object, it can be worked with. But what do you think? Behind the second level, there turned out to be third, even deeper one. These are schemas, fundamental beliefs about oneself, others, and the world. They are laid down early, in childhood experience, in relationships with primary attachment figures. They are highly resistant because they function like axioms. All incoming information is interpreted through them. The psyche experiences them as load-bearing structures, which is why arguing with them is genuinely useless. This is a confirmation bias at the level of the personality. Classical CBT works mainly with the first and second levels. For schemas, a separate extension was developed in the 1990s, Jeffrey Young's schema therapy. Every time people find a new approach, there is a temptation to solve everything through it. But an honest conversation about limitations is actually more interesting than a success story, because it is there that the real architecture of the method becomes visible. What it actually is, not what people tend to think it is. Let's start with the most uncomfortable part. In 2015, a meta-analysis by Falk, Thinling comes out, one of the most cited critical examinations of the CBT evidence base. He looks at effectiveness studies and finds a classic problem – publication bias. Studies with positive results get published. Studies where CBT didn't work go into the file drawer. When this effect is corrected for, the effect size of CBT decreases. And this is important to say out loud, because in popular explanations, CBT is often presented as the gold standard with almost universal applicability. Gold standard, yes. Universal, no. The second point concerns trauma. CBT was created for working with depression and anxiety disorders. There, the cognitive model works well. But when clinicians in the 80s and 90s began working with PTSD, with Vietnam veterans, or with survivors of violence, they encountered something different. Traumatic memory is stored differently. It is not processed like ordinary experience. It remains fragmented, sensory, living in the body rather than in narrative. Attempts to work with it through cognitive disputation often had no effect, or they caused re-traumatization. The person would reproduce the experience again and again without integration. This led to the emergence of EMDR, Francine Shapiro's method, which works with traumatic memory through bilateral stimulation. The mechanism is still not fully understood, and that is a separate story, but its effectiveness for PTSD is even better established than that of the classical CBT. Then came Jung's schema therapy for working with early schemas and personality disorders. Then somatic approaches, Peter Levine, Bessel van der Kolk with his The Body Keeps the Score. All of them are, in some sense, a response to the limits of the CBT. The map expanded where the old map ended. But the most conceptually interesting limitation concerned the basic premise. First and second wave CBT proceed from the idea that the problem lies in the content of thoughts. Thoughts are distorted, unrealistic, dysfunctional, and they need to be challenged and replaced with more accurate ones. In the late 80s and early 90s, a new group of researchers enters the scene and says, wait, what if the problem is not in the content? What if the problem is in our relationship to thoughts? This is Stephen Hayes with ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, and Masha Linan with DBT, Dialectical Behavior Therapy. This is what is usually called the third wave of CBT, although the authors themselves were not always thrilled with that label. Their logic is fundamentally different. The thought "I am a failure" doesn't need to be checked for truth and replaced with a more balanced one. What needs to change is the relationship to it as an event in consciousness. I notice that I am having the thought "I am a failure." Distance, diffusion, literally unhooking from the thought. Because the problem is not that the thought is incorrect. The problem is that the person fuses with it. This is a different architecture of intervention. CBT says, let's test this thought. ACT says, let's change how you relate to it, regardless of whether it's true or not. CBT, in a sense, is still inside Cartesian logic. There are correct thoughts and incorrect thoughts, and the task is to distinguish one from the other. The third wave takes a step toward Buddhist phenomenology, and Hayes does not hide this. He speaks directly about this influence. Thoughts are simply events in consciousness, neither good nor bad. The problem arises when we identify with them. This doesn't mean that CBT is wrong and ACT is right. It means they solve slightly different problems, or enter the same loop from different sides. And finally, about what CBT barely touches. It works with individual thinking, with how a particular person processes a particular experience. But it practically doesn't ask the question, where does this experience come from? If a person lives in a genuinely dangerous environment with real violence, real poverty, real discrimination, cognitive disputation of their anxiety may be neutral at best and at worst, a tool for adapting to something that should not be normal. This is the critique that leftist theorists have been making of CBT since the 90s, and it is not without sense. A method that teaches people to cope better with the system without asking questions about the system is the method with a political charge, even if that charge is invisible. We begin with the question of who perceives reality more accurately. CBT doesn't give access to objective reality, but it does give access to the interpreter. Thanks to the development of neuroplasticity, the repeated practice of a different way of processing information literally changes which neural pathways are activated by default. The skill becomes firmware. Debugging turns into a new operating system. Depressive realism is more accurate in assessing control, but accuracy is not the only criterion of adaptiveness. A healthy brain with an illusion of control acts, tries, makes mistakes and learns. The question is not who sees reality more accurately. The question is what model of reality allows you to live in it, make decisions, and not get stuck in loops that the system reproduces out of itself.